This podcast is a collaboration between Costard and Touchstone Productions and the Dads from the Crypt podcast.
Maybe one of our listeners has a fantasy that's more to your liking. So, okay out there, Lancaster. The lovely Carla's waiting to hear from you. Let's go to the phones. Number here is 555-1234. What? What? Did somebody drop a bomb on you people? Hello, Lancaster? Are you out there? Come in. Or maybe you bumpkins just haven't figured out how to use a telephone yet.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the How Not to Make a Movie podcast. I'm Alan Katz. Before we get down to business, we need to talk a little business. If you enjoy this podcast, and if you don't, perhaps you could direct your masochism accordingly and hit whatever like button is available to you. As silly as it seems, you hitting that like button is one of the key ways the algorithms that rule us all get shaped by us. Another way you can help spread the word about this podcast is by literally spreading the word yourself to your friends and family via social media or by completely old school means, having a conversation. And hey, while I'm pitching podcasts, please check out a few of the other podcasts we're making here at Costard and Touchstone Productions. There's The Donor, a DNA horror story, and The Hall Closet. The Donor is the absolutely true story of Hal, an anonymous sperm donor in the 1980s who lost his donor anonymity when he joined 23andMe, curious about his health genes. Suddenly, 7 total strangers found Daddy, except 6 of them had no idea their actual biological father was Hal, a sperm donor. The Hall Closet is true crime like you've never heard it before, told from deep inside by Donna Hall, who grew up in the 80s and 90s in a lower-tier crime family outside of Philadelphia. The Halls weren't the Corleones, but they made national headlines just the same. Donna's mom, Phyllis, maybe the worst mom ever, was known by the news media as the Home Alone mom of Bucks County. She spent 6 months in prison for child endangerment. Donna's stepdad, a criminal mastermind named John Hall, was the Philly Police Department's favorite snitch. He put more than 25 people behind bars on bullshit confessions that he concocted to mitigate his own considerable legal jeopardy. Among the people John Hall put away was his own stepson, Herb, on a bullshit murder charge, and a man named Walter Ogrod. Walter spent 24 years on death row because of a bullshit John Hall confession. Donna is a rock star of a storyteller, and her own story of growing up in the midst of this madness where almost every single day the adults in her family committed one sort of crime or another. It'll blow your mind. Hey, I have a taste for strange stories, right? If you like Tales from the Crypt and its twisted sensibilities, I promise you will love both The Donor, a DNA horror story, and The Hall Closet. And the best part, they're both absolutely true. I couldn't have made them up if my life depended on it. But I think you'll find that how we tell these stories from deep inside, it's really, really compelling. That's The Donor at thedonorpodcast.com and The Hall Closet at thehallclosetpodcast.com. Or find the links in the show notes or on our website or anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Now that that's over with, if you ask me what I am today, well, I tell you unequivocally, I'm a podcaster. I may have come out of movies and TV, but these days, it's all about podcasting for me. I love this medium. I love its intimacy and, I love the idea of being a voice in the dark. Peter Anthony Holder also came out of TV, news, and public affairs and interviews, and in fact, he was an actual overnight broadcaster, a literal voice in the dark. And while he still thinks of his show, The STUPH FILE, as a radio show rather than a podcast, it's got lots of podcast dynamism to it. That's why I appeared on Peter's show, The STUPH FILE. Hey, he's a great interviewer with a huge track record of great interviews of everyone from actors like Carl Malden and Ed Asner to politicians and trendsetters to Apollo astronaut Alan Bean, who walked on the moon. Anthony grew up in Montreal, Canada, the son of immigrants from Barbados. We talk about what the immigrant experience was like compared to what growing up Black in America is like, where every traffic stop can suddenly become a fatal flashpoint. We also talk about Barbados, one of the best places I've ever gotten to visit. Hey, Barbados Tourist Board, we should talk. Visit Barbados. Like me, Peter grokked what he wanted to be when he was a kid. Like me, he walks around in a state of semi-bliss because he gets to do the thing he loves pretty much every day. After all these years doing what he does, Peter's got almost 2,500 interviews under his belt. Clearly, I've got some catching up to do. Well, let's get this started then. For me, the important parts about having this conversation, in addition to the fact that you're a fascinating human being, is you are used to dealing in 12-minute sound pods. And I want you to have the chance to stretch out here and take, and take all the time you want to say whatever you want.
I'm used to dealing with 12-minute pods because of radio and because of the current show that I'm doing and my previous life in television. But when I did a radio show for 20 years, I had a 3-hour show every night, and it would be normal for me to do a conversation with somebody for over an hour. You know,
that is that's a relief to hear.
Yeah. So I've done that. I did that for most of my adult life.
Cool. I felt like that 12-minute time limit was well, it was a challenge to our creativity, but it's like we just got started.
Yeah, but you say it's a challenge to our creativity, yet you are someone who is very creative from a film and movie kind of view. And isn't it normal when you are challenged either by monetary constraints or time restraints that sometimes that brings out the most creative part of you?
Oh, always. That is always how it works. At Tales from the Crypt, we did not have the luxury of money. We really operated on a rather low budget. And so whenever we were confronted with a problem, we would have to solve it creatively with our heads. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So I even, sometimes the challenges of a form, Shakespeare having to write in iambic pentameter is,
yes.
Those kinds of creative challenges also produce remarkable greatness, as opposed to the ordinary greatness. You were born and raised in Montreal, Peter.
Yep.
But
yes.
Your folks, Horace and Hilda Holder, were originally from Barbados.
That is correct. Yes. And isn't it lovely to have names that sound like that, right?
Well,
Horace and Hilda Holder.
How much of a connection do you have to Barbados?
Most of my family were born there, in some cases raised there. I'm one of 5 children. I'm the only one that was born in Canada, and I still have a lot of relatives there. As a matter of fact, last year I lost an aunt who was living there, and if she had made it to her next birthday, she would have been 102.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have been to Barbados, and I thought it was absolute heaven on earth. What a wonderful, wonderful island. What an extraordinary place. Loved it to pieces.
I used to go there as a kid, and so the last time I was there, I was 12 years old, and then years later, I was working on a radio travel show, and I got to go back, and that was in 1988. So it was the first and only time I was there as an adult. And I remember telling my mom, because I was doing a jaunt through various West Indian islands, and I remember telling my mom, do not alert any of my relatives that I will be showing up in Barbados because I have work to do. I will call some of them. Actually, I called one of them. I will call one of them when I get there and we'll hang out, but I have work to do. I don't need the island greeting me at the airport. So, yeah,
That would have
it
been
was
quite a reception line to work your way through.
at the time it would have been. And back in 1988, there was, like I said, still a lot of relatives that were there.
Like I said, when I visited there a bunch of years ago, it was a whole family trip. It was such a wonderful experience. What a wonderful place. Loved it.
Where, what year did you go back? And may I ask also where you stayed on which side of the island you stayed?
It was, we had a house. I think it was toward the north. The airport's on the south side of the island. Yes, we were on the north side of the island.
Okay, so you were on
North
the
northwest part of the island is where the house was.
were you close to the water?
Yes.
So then you
a
were
3 minute
close.
walk.
Okay, so then you were close to the Atlantic Ocean side as opposed to the Caribbean Sea side.
Yes.
That be correct?
Yes, that would be correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because as they say in Barbados, I mean it's a small island, right? And they often say the island is 26 miles long and a smile wide.
I could believe they said that.
Yes.
I absolutely can. My wife is English, and what she especially appreciated, among many other things, was that they made a proper cup of tea there.
Well, it's funny you should say that because, first of all, Barbados is known as, at least it was up until it became a republic just a few years ago, it was known as Little England.
Yeah.
It only got its independence in 1966. My family basically wants to disown me because I do not drink tea or coffee. So,
You rebel.
and yeah, well, rebel. I mean, for my parents, 2 o'clock was tea time. There was just no doubt about it. So, and no, I'm not a big tea
And
drinker. Never.
and proper tea too, not
Oh
Lipton.
gosh, yes.
Holy cow,
Oh
no.
yes, yeah. It has to be done a certain way. It has to be steeped. It's
Oh, yeah. No, there's ritual. There's ritual
exactly.
to a proper tea. Growing up in Montreal, as you did, though,
Yes.
at you were early on, you knew that you wanted to be in radio. What about radio got you excited at such a tender age?
Well, is it really early on? I mean, I was at the late stage of 7 when I decided I wanted to be in radio. Is that really early?
For some, I suppose.
Okay. I just listened to the radio and I just found that the people who were inside the box, as it were, they just sounded like they were having the best time of their lives. And that's what I wanted to do. My dad bought a reel-to-reel tape recorder, Philips reel-to-reel tape recorder, when I was about 6. And I just basically commandeered that thing. And I would pretend to do a radio show from the time I was 7 years old. And as you know, this country is hockey crazy.
Mm.
And so every kid goes out and plays. If they don't go to an ice rink or a pond, they one of the things is it's a rite of passage for kids is to play ball hockey. I guess it's like the same thing as in the early days or in the 50s and 60s of New York, people would play stickball, right?
Sure.
We play ball hockey. And I was living in a duplex, second floor walk up. And so when the kids were outside playing ball hockey, I was on the balcony doing play by play of the kids playing ball hockey.
Of course you were. Of course you were, and out loud.
Oh, of course, of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
course.
For everyone to hear. It's not like you were doing it quietly to yourself and whispering into your hand. You were doing it for the entire neighborhood to hear. You were calling the game.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, okay. Now, what did you learn early on about, all right, calling a live sports event or about reporting reality?
Wow, that's a deep question. I don't know if I actually learned anything, um,
Well, you
or,
had to
or
begin to
was
make
aware that.
you had to begin to
Or,
make sense of it somehow in order to report it. How
well,
did
I
you?
guess I guess I was mimicking, the people who I grew up watching on television or listening to on the radio. So I guess I was learning by osmosis because I was mimicking the people I listened to and was trying that out. So I guess I
Was
learned something by the fact that I was imitating them.
was there a particular, all right, sports broadcaster who you had in your head who was a gold standard?
Well, again, when I was doing the when I was pretending to do the radio show on my reel-to-reel tape recorder, it wasn't a sportscaster. It was the rock and roll jocks of the '60s back in the day, and
Uh,
one of the ones was a fellow by the name of Buddy G, who I just adored as a child when I was growing up. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier, I said that I worked on a radio travel show. It was for Buddy G, his real name is George Morris. It was for George Morris's company. So the fact that I got to work for someone I idolized as a young child, that alone was heaven. So it was the Buddy G's and the Dave Boxers of the world. And again, on AM radio, especially at late night, you can get radio stations from other places as they come over. When other radio stations power down. So I used to listen to WBZ in Boston because I would get that clearly at night when I was going to bed, and I always had a clock radio on my bedside, and I would listen to the radio ad nauseum, and barely falling asleep because I was just so enamored by what I heard on the radio. So the idea, by the way, years later, that I ended up doing a radio show for 20 years that was a late night show, that's full circle for me.
hmm. Sure, sure, sure. Of course it is. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Before we get into your radio career, there's another interesting thing that I caught from your bio from your youth. It says as a teenager, you worked for 6 years as a theater usher and projectionist.
Yeah. Wow, you've done your homework, haven't you?
I,
That's
I want to
almost
know who I
that's
want to know who
almost
I'm talking to.
that's almost CIA like. It's the information. Yeah, I spent from the time I was 14 to 20, I spent years working as a theater usher. Um, First of all, I'm a major freak of and fan of television and of films. I spent all of my time growing up when I wasn't pretending to be a radio announcer. I was sitting in front of my television set. So and watching old movies because back in those days there wasn't syndicated television show. Usually a local television station would either play whatever the network was playing at that time in the afternoon, or they would show old movies. So I watched a lot of old movies growing up as a kid, and so and I also had a brother-in-law who was a theater manager. And again, like I said, I'm one of five children. I'm also 13 years behind the pack. My sisters were all of my siblings were sisters. So there were a lot of adults around me because, like I said, I'm 13 years behind the pack. By the time I'm cognizant of what's going on, say 6 or 7 or 8, my youngest sister's 20, you know?
Yeah.
So I had brother-in-laws from the time, like for instance, this particular brother-in-law who became my boss, he married my sister when I was 4. So I ended up working at the theater, and that was a job that to me was absolute heaven because it was back in the day when theater ushers were forced to be on the floor. Someone had to be on the floor at all time. You know, someone had to be on the floor to stop people talking. Back in the day, to stop people from smoking. We didn't have the situation where people would have cell phones because that was pre-cell phones, obviously. But in other words, you were just keeping the peace and making sure that everything ran smoothly. So I would see a movie. And movies would last a long period of time if it was first run films and they were very, very popular. I would see a movie 5 times a day, sometimes for months. And I had no problem with that.
Huh. Was there a particular movie that really was great every day?
Well, sometimes people ask me what my favorite movie of all time is, and my favorite film was one I saw as an usher. And by the way, when I first became an usher, like I said, I was 14. So the very first movie I saw was The Paper Chase. Remember John Houseman as the professor?
Sure, of course.
In that film, yeah, that was the very first film. But the film that I truly did love was a small little film that didn't get a lot of traction, but it did earn the actress who played the title role an Academy Award nomination. And that was a film called Claudine, which starred Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones. And the music was done by Curtis Mayfield, and the theme song was sung by Gladys Knight and the Pips, and I was just in heaven. That to me was a quaint little film that just spoke to me.
Awesome. Let's talk about all those years you spent overnight as filling 3 hours a day with stuff. How did you, all right, so in your head, what was that show? What was that show's franchise?
Well, I kind of made it my own because of course, the radio station was around long before I was. And no one had done the show as long as I did. So I just kind of molded it into what I wanted it to be. First of all, when I first wanted to get into radio, there wasn't per se a plethora of talk radio stations. That radio stations kind of morphed into the talk genre, right? The station I was at, which was CJD, and it's still going strong right now. The station I was at was what you would call a heritage radio station. It's that station that was always on in the kitchen when you woke up, and it was also on at night when you went to bed. It was that station, and it's usually the number one station in every market. That was the one I was working at. So when I was growing up, it played interesting music, and it didn't have a lot of talk shows. It morphed into a news talk format years later, and by the time I got to it, it had become that. But the all-night show was always someplace where you could, they would play music occasionally, but you could get people to talk to you, and so I envisioned a show that didn't always that wouldn't talk down to the audience. First of all, our station was very, very strong in talking politics, as a lot of talk stations would do, and I would always say that when people would ask, "What's the show about?" I would say, it's anything but politics. Of course, there are times when you have to do politics, like, for instance, around an election time or whatever the case may be. But generally speaking, I try to not talk politics. And since I was a fan of Hollywood and television and the like, and I would talk about movies and television shows and trivia. And then I would try to interview people whom I had who I idled. You know, it's always interesting to have the opportunity, and I've done hundreds of celebrity interviews over the years, but the best ones for me, from a selfish point of view, are the ones that are people whom I enjoyed when I was a child. You know, it's another thing to talk to actors and actresses who are, at least in my age group, considered peers, or now, as I'm older, who are younger than me, and I enjoy talking to them too. But there's something special about talking to somebody whom you idolized.
I would agree that that adds a certain luster to the conversation.
And the same thing goes with sports figures whom I idolized as a child.
Uh, who were some of the people who, all right, you got them in the chair sitting across from you? Who were some of the ones you were most excited to finally have a few minutes with?
Well, first of all, most of them are not in the chair across from me, because in the case of where they're living, they're from New York or L.A., so they're on the phone.
The metaphorical chair.
But I can mention one that actually did sit across from me, and ironically, at the time that we're recording this, this would have been his birthday. He's no longer with us. He died at the age of 90 a few years ago, and that person was Gavin MacLeod, whom you may remember, of course, from the Mary Tyler Moore Show and The Love Boat. He was in town in Montreal doing a play, and he came in for an hour, and we just chatted, and I had a great time. Now, when you talk about somebody whom I was just gobsmacked in talking to, my favorite interview is somebody else who was also from that show, Mary Tyler Moore, that is, and that would be Cloris Leachman, who I had on for an hour, and she was just an absolute delight. She made me laugh so hard. I actually came to the station that night, and I had a bad cold. And one of the things that's great when you're in the studio in control is you can turn your mic off to cough.
Yes.
And she was on the phone, and she was making me laugh so hard that by the end of the hour, my cold had completely broken, which to me is the definition of laughter heals.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Indeed. You have a data set.
Exactly.
What was Soul Call, which you did for 8 years?
Oh, wow. Now we're doing a deep dive. Okay.
Well, hey, is there any other kind?
Soul Call was a television show that I had hosted, and I was not the first host, and I'll tell that story in a moment. It was a show that was on a community television station that had a lot of shows that came on that dealt with various racial backgrounds, community groups, ethnic groups. And so there were all kinds of shows that were on that particular station, which was CH, which was part of the Global Television Network, and under the auspices of various groups, various racial groups and regions of the world. So Soul Call was basically a show that dealt with the Black community. I came to this show, and first of all, I've had an extensive career in both radio and television. I've applied for every radio job that I had because that's my passion, that's my jam, that's my joy. I have had lots of television shows. I have yet to apply for one. Every television show literally fell in my lap. And in the case of Soul Call, I refused the show, not once, but not twice. Actually, twice. I refused the show twice. And when they came to me a third time, well, there's an interesting story well, because the first time the show had not gone on the air yet, and they said they'd like me to host the show. I had no desires of doing it. And my desires were quite frankly selfish from my perspective. I grew up in a time when there were no black people on radio or television, at least locally. And if we were on television or
That was
radio,
true. That was true in Canada too.
yeah. And if that were the case, we were only on specific things. So we did kind of like music shows that dealt with soul and R&B,
Mm-hmm.
or we had these shows that were like Soul Call, that I would say, for lack of a better term, would ghettoize the communities, and all of the communities, not just ours, but all of the other communities that were on that station. And or they would put you as a sportscaster.
Yeah. Now this kind of raises a question. All right.
Yeah, so they would put you as a sportscaster, and so I decided I was never going to be doing any of those things. So the first time that the Soul Call came along was before it went on the air. When it was still in the pitch stage, and I said absolutely no, I'm not doing that. Then about a week before the show went on the air, they came to me again, and I said no. My answer is still no. And then 6 months after the show went on the air, they came to me again. And I decided I was going to make outrageous statements about wardrobe, control of the show, and salary. And I figured this will make them go away. Well, they met all my demands. Wow. And I was trapped. I was literally trapped. I had no reason to say no. And one of the things, like I said, one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to control how the show was structured and who the guests would be. And that's what I wanted to, that's one of the things I wanted to do. And they went along with everything I said. And I felt, okay, I blew my wad on this one. I said what I wanted, and they caved, and now I'm stuck. And by the way, I was mad because I thought for sure they would say, yeah, let's get somebody else. But they went with everything I said, so I ended up being stuck. So one of the first things I did was, and I said a lot of all the communities were on that station. So there was the Greek show and the Jewish show and the Korean show, and the list went on and on and on. And the one thing that I find very interesting is that, when I grew up, I lived in a very multicultural community. And the one thing that people my age had in common was we were all born in Canada, but our parents were born somewhere else. So I always had an immigrant's mentality. I decided that I was going to get together and have the hosts of all of the other shows, not at the same time, but periodically, show up on our show to discuss what we have in common as opposed to what we have differently. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the things I wanted to do. I didn't want to, again, like ghettoize the show. It's a black show and it's only for blacks. And no, it's for everybody who's interested in what our culture has to offer, but we're also interested in what other people's culture has to offer. So that's the kind of show I did, and I did that for 9 years.
How do you see racism north of the border versus south of the border? Because one thing America clearly is a deeply racist country, always has been, and we've made it now we've put it back on the table and said this is who we really are. All right, there is also racism north of the border. I don't think it. All right, we're going to compare racism. It is a sad statement that there's racism north and south of the border.
Well, I can only speak to it from a black perspective, and from that, I'm going to make, and it's a blanket statement, and it's only my truth, so it may not fly with other people, but if I'm going to say what's the difference between a black Canadian and an American black, I would say that for the most part, we, meaning here in Canada, are for the most part immigrants. Um, I would say that the black movement in the United States came about because uh, they have 400 years of history. And when World War II came along, a lot of them enlisted and became part of the military might of the United States during World War II. And they fought side by side. And sometimes in those cases, or not a lot of, in a lot of those cases, they had camaraderie within the ranks. Yes, there were segregated ranks in certain areas, but there was camaraderie in what everyone was fighting for. And that was an opportunity where blacks had a sense of pride in what they did. And then when the war was over, they suddenly went back to second-class citizen. And that's when they decided that ain't happening. And that was what the civil rights movement was. Here in Canada, with the exception of the people who came up through the Underground Railroad and settled in Canada, most of the black Canadians are like myself, first and second generation. And as a result, we have an immigrant's mentality. We don't necessarily rock the boat, as opposed to some people who have been around generationally for 200 years. And so that's the biggest thing is American blacks have a chip on their shoulder, and rightly so, because of the amount of time they have been there and they haven't proceeded or progressed further. Canadian blacks, to a certain degree, you know, we're a non-rock the boat, and that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean that our fight is different. We just, for lack of a better term, accept it more, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's a reality.
It's a different strain of racism. This is an anti-immigrant racism, whereas in the United States, it's slavery.
Yes, exactly.
Slavery is really what we're having an argument about because, well, how can you possibly claim out of one side of your head that all men are created equal and then cut a deal with slavery? That is a contradiction you cannot live. And I would say it finally caught up with us.
People often say, and it does happen here, it doesn't happen here to the extent that it happens in your country. I've never been stopped for DWB, driving while black.
Right.
Now, I know a lot of people who have been stopped for that, but that has never been my experience. But anytime I talk to a black person from the United States, that's always been their experience.
You spent 6 years as a news anchor at Global News in Montreal?
Television anchor, yep, that's correct. Again, that another job that fell in my lap.
Boy,
I had no desire to do that. And again, my radio job, that 20-year show I mentioned, it came to an end. There were some layoffs at the radio station, and I was one of them. And because I had been there for 20 years, they had to give me a nice severance package. So I wasn't in a hurry to do anything. And as soon as it was announced that I was gone, and that was a story that made the newspapers in town, When that came to an end, I was more than happy to actually create the program that you were a guest on, the Stuff File program, and I was just doing that from my home studio, and I got a phone call from Global, and they wanted me to come and do some lineup work for their newscast. And I figured, well, it gets me out of the house and it pays me a few bucks, and I can do that.
Why
I can
not?
do the line. I can do it. It keeps me busy.
Hmm.
But they had an ulterior motive. They wanted to see if I could write news. And again, like I said, I had done Soul Call for 9 years before that,
Sure.
and it was part of the same company, so to speak, at the time. So they called me in, and I was writing news for a while, and then they said, the news director, she said to me, "We'd like you to do an audition to anchor the news." And I said, "No, I don't really want to do that." And they said, "Well, um, amuse me. Let's anchor the news." And even though I had spent a lot of years in television at that point, one of the things I had never done is I had never used a teleprompter. So I told her, I've never used a teleprompter. He said, "Well, what we'll do is we'll set up this a situation in the afternoon, and you'll just do a newscast. You'll write up the newscast as you normally do, and what we'll take is we used to do a 6 o'clock and an 11 o'clock newscast every day.
Sure.
And first of all, I should say that our control room, we had a remote control room. Our control room was in Edmonton, 2,000 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So the news director said to me, "Take your pick. You can rewrite yesterday's 11 o'clock or yesterday's 6 o'clock so that it's in your own vernacular. Rewrite the newscast, send it to the teleprompter. I'm getting the crew in Edmonton to do a demo tape for you. We'll do it." I said, "Okay." So I wrote the newscast in my vernacular, and I sent it to the teleprompter. And so I'm in this suit and tie, and I'm behind the desk, and I'm starting to read the teleprompter. And I'm making not many mistakes, but a few mistakes. And so I hear in my ear from the director when it's done, he said, "So how did you feel about that?" I said, "Well, I made a few mistakes, and it's really annoying to me. I made a few mistakes in some simple words, but it may be okay." And he said, "Well, yeah, I see you made some mistakes, and it's probably because you were nervous, and but I mean, you wrote the script." And I said, "Well, no, actually, I didn't write that script, because I wrote the 6 o'clock one, and you put in the 11 o'clock script, and that was not my script. So I was reading it cold." And he said, "Oh, well, in that case, that was fantastic." So,
Framing is everything, isn't it?
yeah. So I ended up getting the job, and I did that for 6 years.
Wow. Well done.
But again, it wasn't my love. I mean, like I did radio for a long, long time, and I always said in the back of my mind, "God, I'd do this for free." I'm just having so much fun. I have to admit, I anchored the news for 6 years, but to me, it was a paycheck. I mean, I was very credible at what I was doing, and I was very determined in what I was doing, and I enjoyed it to a certain degree, but it wasn't my passion.
No, for 6 years you lent that business your credibility and your talent,
Yeah.
your skills, and then you decided enough. It's enough. Been there, done that. On to other things.
Well, again, the job came to an end, um, and I go back to the old radio gig. I did overnight radio for 20 years, and when the show came to an end, um, I was replaced by a syndicated show. I anchored the news on weekends here in Montreal, 6 and 11 o'clock, and when that came to an end, um, it was syndicated from Toronto. So in the last two jobs I had for the better part of 26 years, I was let go but never replaced.
You were, in a sense, the last man standing.
Exactly. So, yeah.
So, in essence, the business has been collapsing around your ears.
Yeah, kinda.
Damn.
Kinda.
Well, good thing podcasting is here to catch us all.
Well, it's funny because the show I do called the Stuff File program, I never actually called it a podcast because yes, it is on all the podcasting platforms, but I always said it was a radio show. And in my head, again, structure was always something that was always very important to me. You grow up in radio business, you have a radio clock. And I kept this radio clock even with the Stuff File program. And it was always my intention of the show being on other radio stations, to the point where now it's on about 10 radio stations. So it's always been a radio show for me.
When you think of radio stations, you're thinking of terrestrial broadcasters.
Yes, it's on about 10 terrestrial radios. Yeah.
The less and less of the world is consuming content that way, and more of the world is consuming content this way.
Yes, absolutely.
And
certainly generationally.
Yeah, for sure. And hey, at its bottom line, podcasting, after all, is just radio.
Yeah.
That's not being broadcast. It's being delivered, in essence, peer to peer.
Yes, absolutely.
I think of it as the Napster effect coming for everybody.
One of the things that I was enamored with when I was a kid, and I still collect it, I collect old-time radio, radio dramas, radio comedies. And in some cases, when you think of old-time radio, some of the podcasts, some of the true crime podcasts, it's like old-time radio.
In the best way.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the additional, the technology has made it so that everybody can do this. Now, yes, everybody can do this, but not everybody can do this well. Fortunately, because
I think the analogy I use is everyone can do this, but should everyone?
But yes. I always think it's a good thing that not everyone is as good as some of us are, because then either we would have to be even better just to compete, or it just be exhausting. And so it's just as well that most of the world is mediocre, because it makes it easier for those of us who we might be able to rise above it. It's an easier job to rise above. So I'm grateful that there's the podcasting still, it's incredibly democratic. And I always think of it this way, having spent my career in film and TV, to take an idea from my head to get it into a movie or a TV show, there are thousands of assholes standing in my way. And at any one point, any one of those assholes can kill a project dead just because they're an asshole. With a podcast, there's only ever one asshole standing in my way, and it's me. And I can deal with that guy. And so long as I get the work done, okay, I got to find the audience, and I got to help the audience find me. But okay, I will take that. I'll take that bet. like I said, the Napsterization of everything. What Napster did was it broke the music business by, if I wanted, hey, before Napster, if I wanted to get new music, I'd have to go to the record store and pay the exorbitant amount they were charging for, what is it, a record, a cassette tape, or an 8-track. And it was always a stupid amount that they were charging. It was always offensive. But Napster cut out the music store. It cut out the music, hey, the music production, the publishing company, because I I could share music files with my friends peer to peer.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, before Napster, musical acts would, well, all the money was in the recorded music, so they would tour to support their album sales. When Napster destroyed the value of recorded music because anyone could get it more or less for free, it changed the whole dynamic. And suddenly, the only way to make money, unless you're one or two acts, you have to tour. You have to give away the music, and you make all your money touring on ticket sales and merch. And because really it's peer to peer, it's musician and fan, it's the live experience. It's as close to, being in the same room for that performance as possible. That same peer to peer experience has hit everywhere. Hey, what's an Uber or a Lyft driver except for a peer to peer replacing a taxi driver?
Right.
Because of the way that you get them, even the way that food is delivered, everything. It came for everyone. Hey, YouTube basically made it possible for everyone to be in the movie and TV business. And my kids don't have a cable company. They don't have that. They watch, so long as they have an internet connection of some kind of connectivity, they watch stuff on YouTube.
But do you miss do you miss the sense of ownership that one would have? I mean, when we were growing up, you collected records, you collected albums, you collected tapes. That became cassettes. That became CDs.
I can
But
tell you,
nowadays,
having moved many, many times, especially later in my life when we were having financial difficulties, and my
right?
record collection became a burden.
Mm-hmm.
It became, I had all that stuff, but the truth is, all right, yes, vinyl sounds better than electronic, but I don't have the equipment that really makes that discernment clear. So really,
Right.
if I want to listen to my music, I could listen to it electronically at any time. I didn't have to cart that stuff around for the years and years and years and years and years that I did. So where podcasting is concerned, it's also the ownership question. I love the fact that we own everything that we do.
Right.
And if we're lucky enough, should there be a cash stream into what we're doing, well, whether it's through advertising dollars, that basically comes to us. Or if we can monetize through a relationship with our fans, through subscriptions and additional content that we provide for these people, well, how much more peer-to-peer do you want to get in terms of the relationship between the content creator, the content consumer, and how it all gets paid for?
I feel I've gone full circle only because I started when I was 7 years old talking into a tape recorder in my
Yeah,
room.
yeah, you
And
have.
I'm now I'm literally doing that right now talking to you. And when I do the stuff file program, I'm doing that as well. It's like
But
I've
you're
come full
reaching
circle.
so many more people now.
Yeah. I was reaching no one at that point. But
Right.
now I am.
And
But
you're
but
so much better at it now, too.
well, time time does make that possible. I mean, I had a great education on the fly education in radio early in my days, and I have the giants that walked before me, at least in this market, who I was on the shoulders of. So I just soaked up all of their knowledge and added a little bit of my own.
Well, yes, of course, and that is worth every bit of everyone the same as everyone else's because it's all experiential.
Exactly. Yes.
Of all the people that you've interviewed, and you've interviewed some very cool people, everyone from Carl Malden that you mentioned, Cloris Leachman and Ed
Hmm.
Asner and Michael Moriarty and Lindsay Wagner and Carol Channing and Buddy Ebsen and Bob Denver and Dick Van Patten and
Yeah.
two guys who left their footprints on the moon.
Yeah. Alan Bean and Harrison Schmitt. Alan Bean was on what? Apollo 10? Yes. And Harrison Schmitt was on the last Apollo mission. Yeah, I was a big fan of theirs. I believe Harrison is still alive. Alan has since passed away. Um, Again, it was something that I wanted to do, and one of the things that was enjoyable from my doing the radio show and now doing the Stuff File program is I get to talk to whoever I want, and most of the times it's somebody that I'm curious about. Do you remember the television series that was on HBO, From the Earth to the Moon?
Sure.
Okay, so on that show, it was a 10 episode series, an hour each episode. And the very first episode was the landing of man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. And all I kept thinking was, well, this is going to be an interesting series. How are they going to keep the interest for the next 9 episodes when the biggest news would be man landing on the moon in the first place? How will they keep this interesting for subsequent episodes? Well, flash forward to the episode that dealt with Harrison Schmitt. And again, this is a dramatization. This is not a documentary. So there were actors playing the roles and the storyline that went along with it. And all I thought when I saw the depiction of Harrison Schmitt was, I don't know if this guy is the real deal and if he is actually as he is depicted. But if he is half of what the show is depicting him out to be, this man is fantastic. Right?
What were they
I
depicting
need to
him out to
track
be?
him. Sorry?
Like, how are they depicting him? Well,
Well, first of all, he worked. He was the only scientist who went to the moon. He was a geologist, and of course, when you're going to the moon, you have to work on various space missions on the ground in collaboration with the people who go into space before you get your shot. So his story was a fascinating one in that he was a geologist and he was on the last mission to the moon. And so he had some real scientific background when it came to literally moon rocks. Later in life, after he obviously came back home, he went into politics and he worked in politics he worked in federal politics from his own state. So I just found him an exceptional character, and I wanted to speak to the real Harrison Schmitt. So I had him on the air as a guest, and I had him on more than one occasion. And first of all, I'm fascinated with space exploration. So the idea of talking to astronauts is
yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
a delight for me.
I totally hear you. I totally hear you.
And the other thing about Alan Bean was, when it comes to sailing ships that came to the New World, there are a lot of people on those ships. There's a lot more room on those ships. So on the ship, they always had someone who was an artist, who can depict what the new land was, the mountains and the trees and the indigenous people, whatever the case may be. In a space capsule, which has 3 people crammed into it, you can't afford to take an artist. But Alan Bean was an artist. And he wrote a book that's a coffee table book that deals with his artistry. And so from that perspective, he was someone who, his coffee table book was called Apollo, an eyewitness account by astronaut, explorer, artist, moonwalker, Alan Bean. And so I found him fascinating for one reason. The second reason I found him interesting was I was going to write a book, a trivia book, called Who Came Second? And the reason why I want to write this book is that everyone always talks about who came first. Someone had to come second.
It's a great idea. I love that idea. That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
And the reason why I came up with that idea for the book is every time, people always talk about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. But runners, as you know, they only run as fast as their competition, because that competition is pushing them to go faster. So who was behind Roger Bannister?
Who was pushing who was pushing Roger Bannister?
Exactly. So the reason why I wanted to talk to Alan Bean is because he went to he took the second moon mission to the lunar surface. Now, I don't want to take anything away from Neil Armstrong, but the reality is all Neil had to do to be successful was to get there and back. Anybody else who went after him had to do experiments, had to do other things, had to do something that was different that forwarded the Apollo mission. And so I wanted to know what the perspective was from Alan Bean to being second.
What was your takeaway?
I found him interesting. First of all, it was I found him gracious and interesting. I found him interesting because he was an artist. And again, with the exception of Harrison Schmitt, all of the guys who were Apollo astronauts, they were basically flyboys, right? They were Air Force or Navy pilots. When one of the things I talked to Alan Bean about was how did he feel about Alan Shepard hitting a golf ball on the moon? And at the time, he said, at the time that happened, he thought it was the dumbest idea in the world. But he said in retrospect that he thought, if I had a chance to go back to the moon, I'd throw a football. I would do things and let the person who was on the moon with me catch it. I would do something that would galvanize the kids in the world who would say, oh, that sounds interesting. And bring out the personality of the people who went to the moon, and bring out the lore of those who went to the moon. And yes, they're doing important scientific work, but they're also having a little bit of fun. And that's something that kids might identify with.
It's like trying to make STEAM, trying to make science and technology and math and all those things interesting to kids, because
exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing I asked both men, and of course I had them on separate occasions. I asked them the question, when they look back at the Earth from the moon, did that make you more religious or less religious? And both of them said roughly the same thing in different ways, but they said that the people who went to the moon who were religious came back more religious. And the people who went to the moon who were atheists came back more of an atheist, which I thought was interesting.
There was proof that they were right from that perspective.
Yeah. And I also asked them, what's it like standing, in your backyard today, looking up at the moon, knowing that you're one of only 12 people that are up there? I mean, it's kind of sad that it's been 50 years since anyone else had gone to the moon.
Yeah.
Only 12 people have done that.
A great aspiration.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, there are some people who still don't believe that they did. Anyway.
And then there's that.
And then there's that.
Peter, what's on tap for the future for you?
What's on top of the future? I just want to continue doing the Stuff File program. I didn't think that when I first started this, because when my radio show came to an end back in 2009, I always said they can take away the frequency, which was 800 on the dial, but they can't take away the show. Right. And I'll just keep doing the show for as long as I can do it, and as long as I can get people who are willing to be on the show. And it's 16 years later.
Wow.
So
that's a lot.
I'll just keep.
How many total people have you talked to? Any idea?
Well, it's usually 3 a show, and the next show will be show number, because I'm anal retentive. I number them. The next show will be number 0811.
08. So 811 times 3. That's 8, 16, 24, like 2,500 people.
And by the way, if you were to ask me who would be on this particular show, I have 3 guests. The third guest is a guy named Leighton Campbell, who is the author of Your Happiness Quotient. The second guest is a fellow by the name of John Mahaffey, who is a former PGA tour. He's won 10 PGAs, but he's now the author of, and he became a broadcaster on the PGA channel, but he's now an author of thriller novels, and his latest one is called Hoodwinked. And the first guest on the show this week is some guy named, what's his name? Alan Katz.
Oh dear. There goes that episode.
So that's the next show.
I hope the 2 other people will shine brightly so that your audience will go, well, at least Peter redeemed himself at the end with those 2 other guests.
So that's the show that I'm doing. So to answer your question, I have no plans for the future. I just want to keep trucking on and doing what I'm doing because I'm having the time of my life doing it.
You are doing your future plans as we speak.
Yeah.
Nothing
wrong.
Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I'm so glad that we took the time to extend this conversation. There was so much more I wanted to know as we sat and we talked after our interview together for the Stuff File was concluded. It just seemed, there was and still is so much more to talk about.
I will give out a secret because I don't know if we talked about this the last time we chatted after our interview, but people often ask me, why is the show called the Stuff File program?
Hey.
And why stuff is spelled STUPH. And the reason why it's spelled STUPH is PH is are my initials. That's all.
Oh, well, gosh, yes, of course. Of course, Peter Holder.
And the reason why In the business, be it to television news or radio news, there's something called, for lack of a better term, the kicker story. And that's the story that's usually at the end of the newscast. You
Mm-hmm.
know, cat caught in a tree and a fireman takes it down, or the humorous story. The story that is either heartwarming or funny or ridiculous is the story that usually ends the newscast. And the news station that I was on was the number one news station in the city. So we prided ourselves on news. But my show was an overnight show, and we had news on the hour every hour with a newsman coming from the newsroom. And when I started my show, I said I was going to start off with a whole bunch of kicker stories. And I just called it, here's the stuff in the news. The stuff you don't get in the news. Here is the news that you don't get. The stuff.
The stuff that didn't make the cut.
Yeah. So that's the stuff that. So when I created this show, and I was never fond of naming a show after myself. Any other show on the radio station, it was always, the Joe Blow show or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
And I never wanted to play that because it's not about me. I just had a problem with that. So my last name is Holder, and I did an overnight show, so I called it Holder Overnight because I love to play on words.
Yeah. Perfect. Hey, sometimes things just seem to fall into your lap, my friend.
Exactly. So as a result, I named the show Holder Overnight. And I don't. Have you had a chance to listen to one of the shows?
I have not. No, I have not.
Okay. Because the opening of the show starts off with, do you remember when NBC first went color?
I do, yes.
And the opening of the show was
Peacock.
The Peacock.
Mm-hmm.
And the line was, the following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I edited that. And if you listen to the opening of the show is, the following program is brought to you in living color. And then the theme song plays. And I thought this was very, very interesting when I first started doing the radio show, because A, it's on radio. So that alone is funny. Mm-hmm. And B, I don't necessarily talk about myself. I talk to people about things. I'm not one of those opinionated talk show hosts. It's not about me. It's what are you doing? What's in your life? Let's play a game on the air, that kind of thing. So I never went on the air and said, "Hi, I'm Peter Anthony Holder and I'm a black guy." But my show always started with, the following program is brought to you in living color. That's all I needed to say.
Indeed. Well, you were presenting it as the perspective.
Yeah. So the Stuff File program still has that today. So again, all of the stuff that you hear on the Stuff File program is a microcosm of what I used to do on the radio for 20 years.
Hey, you can't keep a good man down, you know. I cannot thank you enough for coming on my little podcast, on my podcast, I suppose, because yours is a radio show. It's not an actual podcast, but I consider you part of the podcasting community.
I accept that.
and I am very, very fond of this community that I am now part of. Where, just to remind everyone, where can they find you on a regular basis, Peter?
Well, they can find me on, again, all of the podcast platforms that are available. They can check us out on Patreon. As I do you
Go for it.
uh,
And you'll send me the links. I'll put your links on my page so that
yeah.
people can find you. Yeah.
Do you want to know what I read again? Because I grew up with Gary Owens, and I grew up with all the announcers.
Oh wow.
I loved Ernie Anderson. He was the guy that said the Love Boat,
Yeah.
and he was the ABC announcer for years and years. Those are the people that I idolized. So when I end my show every week, I say the same blurb, which gives all the information that you need. The website is thestuffile.com, where you'll find information and links on all of our guests by going to the weekly Stuff File page. Just look for the corresponding program number, and once again, that program number for your show is 0811. Email me at peter@thestuffile.com. You can also find me on Facebook, Spoutable, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as PA Holder. Check us out on patreon.com, where you can become a patron of the program. See you back here for our next show on the air, online, or as a download. We're coming to you from everywhere, including kdxradio.com, over the air on World FM in New Zealand, WLSL LP-FM in Dade City, Florida, KZZH LP-FM in Eureka, California, CKUW-FM in Winnipeg, CFMU in Hamilton, CKLU in Sudbury, Local 107.3 FM in St. John, CHSR in Fredericton, and also streaming on just about any streaming service your little heart desires.
Wow. And on that bombshell, I thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in as always. We'll see you next time. The How Not to Make a Movie podcast is executive produced by me, Alan Katz, by Gil Adler, and by Jason Stein. Our artwork was done by the amazing Jody Webster, and Jason and Jody, along with Mando, are all the hosts of the fun and informative Dads from the Crypt podcast. Follow them for what my old pal the Crypt Keeper would have called terrific crypt content.